I don't know half of you half as well as I should like, and I like less than half of you half as well as you deserve. Maya Gavan and Melyn, and welcome to another Tolkien Untangled Top 10 list. Today is March the 25th, the day that the ring was finally destroyed in the cracks of doom, and thus it is also Tolkien Reading Day. The theme this year is love and friendship. So, to celebrate that, here is a list of my top 10 favourite loving friendships in all of Tolkien's Middle-earth writings. Number 10. Samwise Gamgee and Bil the Pony. Right, these two legends have one of the most feel-good stories in all of Tolkien's Legendarium. It begins in Bree, with the hobbits in the prancing pony and a nameless pony belonging to an absolute piece of crap called Bil Ferny. When the other hobbit ponies were let loose by servants of the Nazgul, which probably includes Bil Ferny, he sells Sam his own pony for 3 times its worth. Sam named the pony after its horrendous former owner, and then Sam threw an apple at Bil Ferny's head, and thus began one of the greatest friendships in Middle-earth's history. Bil the Pony loved his master Samwise like Samwise loved his master Frodo. And Sam cared for Bil and fed him back to health on their journey from Bree to Rivendell, and when Sam finally left Rivendell a few months later, Bil left too. They journeyed south with the Fellowship through Wolf Country, they passed the ruins of Eregion, where the Rings of Power were forged, and along the pass of Caradhras before the mountain defeated them. But, as you'll all know, these two friends were eventually separated outside the west wall of Moria. While Sam went away on his own journey all the way into Mordor, Bil went in the opposite direction, and he made the 300-mile-long return journey all on his own, through the Troll Shores and the wilds of the north until he arrived home in Bree, to the stables of the Prancing Pony, in fact. And after 9 months of being apart, this is where Sam and Bil are eventually reunited. After the quest is complete, Bil accompanies Sam and the other hobbits on their homeward journey to the Shire, and he is with them when they discover all the awful things that have been done to their home since they've been away. And this is where things come full circle, because of all of Saruman's ruffians that the hobbits could have run into, the one they meet at the Brandywine Bridge is Bil Ferny. And we all know that Bil Ferny is no match for Samwise Gamgee, or any of the hobbits really. Between the 4 of them, they have taken down a war troll, they've taken down Isengard, they've taken down Shelob, the Witch King, and Sauron himself in Frodo's case, all in the span of about 20 days. But it isn't a little hobbit who finishes off Bil Ferny, it is the pony. After Bil Ferny throws a key at Merry's head, Bil the Pony let fly with his heels, and he kicked his former owner as he ran off into the night, never to be seen or heard from again. But the other Bil, the good Bil, he stays at Sam's side throughout the rest of the story. In fact, in the very final chapter of The Lord of the Rings, when Frodo and Sam and the other ring-bearers journey to the Grey Havens and all but Sam sail west, it is Bil the Pony who bears him, there and back again. Number 9. Kalibrimbor and Narv. So, Kalibrimbor and Narv are not the best known names in Tolkien's Legendarium, but their friendship is both a wonderful part of their respective characterization, and also it represents a much wider and further reaching friendship that shapes 2 of the greatest realms in the Second Age, Eregion and Khazad-dûm. So, Kalibrimbor is, of course, the elven ringsmith, the guy who forged the Rings of Power under Sauron's guidance, albeit unknowingly. But Rings of Power are not the only famous things that Kalibrimbor made, and this segues us over to Narv. Narv was a dwarven craftsman of Khazad-dûm who lived during the reign of King Durin III during the Second Age. And what's very cool about Narv is that he had such a historical historically significant interracial friendship with fellow craftsman Kalibrimbor. I know that there's a famous enmity in Middle-earth between some elves and some dwarves, but this historical hostility simply is not relevant to Kalibrimbor and Narv. And because of the friendship that exists between these two characters, there also grows a great friendship between their respective realms. Eregion lies pretty much on the northern doorstep of Khazad-dûm's western side, and during the days of Kalibrimbor and Narv, the elves and dwarves lived together in harmony. Khazad-dûm is a safe and open road connecting the elves of the east to the elves of the west, and the wealth of Khazad-dûm is only made richer by the skills of Eregion. This is elves and dwarves at their peak in Middle-earth. And the most famous thing that Kalibrimbor and Narv did together was build the doors of Durin, that of course the Fellowship are one day going to enter through. Narv, he provided the door's grey slabs that Tolkien describes as harder than stone, and Kalibrimbor embellished them with elven ithildine, which is the name of a type of magical writing that can only be revealed by moonlight and the right combination of words. And so this is why the dwarven doors of Moria have an elvish password. The dwarven doors open at the uttering of the elvish word for friend, because Kalibrimbor and Narv made it so. Number 8. Bilbo and Balin. So, there are a lot of great friendships in The Hobbit, but I think my favourite one is the friendship between Bilbo and Balin. If we look at the unfinished tales, we'll learn that Balin was actually, if unintentionally, a pretty important part of why Bilbo ended up accompanying the dwarves on their quest in the first place. A few months before the unexpected party in which Bilbo first met the dwarves, Thorin and Balin and a few others met up with Gandalf to discuss him. And Thorin was pretty skeptical at Gandalf's suggestion for a hobbit to accompany them, but it was Balin who came to the incorrect conclusion that Bilbo must be a trained treasure hunter and a thief. At this suggestion, Gandalf gets pretty insulted on Bilbo's behalf, but it is in Gandalf's defense of Bilbo that he makes the argument that finally convinces Thorin. In his frustration, Gandalf says, "Listen to me, Durin's folk. If you persuade this hobbit to join you, you will succeed. If you do not, you will fail. If you refuse to even try, then I have finished with you." And following this, Thorin agrees to go to Bag End and to meet Bilbo Baggins, and the rest is history. Anyway, during the quest of Erebor, we see over and over and over again that more so than any other dwarf, Balin really does like Bilbo, and he demonstrates a great deal of kindness and compassion for this unusual hobbit. After Bilbo's disastrous attempt to burgle the three trolls, it was Balin who came to check on him. It was Balin who had grasped Bilbo's plan better than the rest when they were captured by the spiders of Mirkwood, and it was Balin who volunteered to accompany Bilbo inside the Lonely Mountain before his first encounter with Smaug, and it was Balin who carried him back out again. Obviously, in the story, all the dwarves warmed up to Bilbo in the end, even Thorin, but I think it's really lovely that Balin was a friend to Bilbo from day one. When Bilbo officially joined the dwarves outside the Green Dragon in Bywater, it was Balin who shouted "Bravo!" and welcomed him into the company. And the friendship of Balin and Bilbo does not even end with their quest. Tolkien tells us in the appendices that 8 years after the events of The Hobbit, Balin ventured away from Erebor again, and he journeyed with Gandalf all the way across the mountains to the Shire for one more cup of tea with Bilbo. Number 7. Olorine and the First Elves. Alright, so this one is a little bit different, but it is a really wonderful part of the Legendarium that only gets a blink and you miss it mention in the Silmarillion. although it is a friendship that has such incredibly far-reaching ramifications, and it's one of the earliest friendships in the entire history of Middle-earth. So, Olorine. Who is he? Well, regardless of whether or not you're familiar with that name, you are definitely familiar with the character that it belongs to, or at least the character that Olorine eventually turns into, because Olorine is simply the name of a Maya spirit who, in the Third Age, will be bound in the limited form of an old man and sent to Middle-earth, where he becomes known as Gandalf, among quite a few other names. But before Gandalf became Gandalf, he was an angelic being called Olorine, and tens of thousands of years before he became known for his grey robes and his long beard, Olorine developed a beautiful friendship with some of the first elves ever to awaken in the world. However, before I get to them, I do want to talk about another character whom Olorine was very close with, and that is Nienna, a lady of the Valar, basically one of the goddesses of Tolkien's legendarium. And the reason that Nienna matters is because she was one of Olorine's teachers, and it would seem she was a very formative part of his youth. And I say youth there in air quotes. You see, Nienna is the Valier of compassion, and pity, and mercy. And Olorine is an attentive student of hers. These are the values that he takes with him to Middle-earth, and these are the values that first brought Olorine into contact with the first elves. In the Valaquenta, we are told that Olorine loved the elves, and walked among them unseen, or at times he walked among them in an elvish form. And Olorine gave to these elves fair visions that made them wiser just by being friends with him. For a while he dwelt in secret at Cuir-Vienen, that's the place where the first elves awoke, and after the Valar learned that they existed, he helped to protect them from the monsters of Melkor. In fact, one of the main things that Olorine did for these elves was to ignite hope in their hearts, and to turn them away from despair, which is, of course, incredibly similar to what we see Gandalf doing many thousands of years later in the Third Age. It's an easy thing to miss, I think, but we can speculate that if Olorine hadn't befriended the earliest elves and lived among them in an elvish form, then perhaps Melkor's corruption and dominion of that race would have been much more successful much earlier on. And who knows how different things would have been if that were the case. If not for Olorine, right at the beginning of elvish history, perhaps there would be no free people left for Gandalf to befriend in the Third Age. Number 6. Eomer and Gimli. Now, Eomer is one of those characters that every time I reread The Lord of the Rings, I like him more and more. I think he's an absolutely awesome character. Over the course of The Lord of the Rings, he obviously develops a deep friendship with Aragorn, and by the end of that story, they stand together as equals, two kings of men, united in war and friendship, and both enriched with a little bit of Dúnedain blood. Remember, Eomer's grandmother was of Númenórean descent. Anyway, as interesting as that may be, it is actually Eomer's friendship with Gimli that I really want to talk about, because this is such a big deal, not just for these two individuals, but also for all of their respective peoples. And it is made even more wonderful by the fact that these characters got off to such a bad start. As I reckon everyone knows, Eomer and Gimli first meet when Aragorn, Legolas and Gimli are sprinting through Rohan to rescue Merry and Pippin from the very Uruk-hai that Eomer and his Eored have just slaughtered the night before. And due to the dark days that have fallen on Rohan by this point, Eomer is very suspicious of the strangers that he finds in his lands, and he asks them if they are elvish folk, and Aragorn replies that they're not, except Legolas, but they do wear cloaks and they carry gifts from Lothlorien, and they travel with the favour of the lady Galadriel. Now, this is very important because Eomer and all the other men of Rohan do not have any sort of a relationship with Galadriel or any of the Elves of Lothlorien. And being horsemen, they typically stay out of weird magical forests in their part of the world, and the only things they've really heard about a Lady of the Golden Wood are the rumours of their ancestors and the stories of a sorceress who dwells there. And so, when Aragorn confirms to Eomer that yes, Galadriel is in fact a real person, Eomer says, "Few escape her nets, they say. But if you have her favour, then you are also net weavers and sorcerers maybe." And this ignorant criticism of Galadriel is the reason that Eomer and Gimli get off to such an unfriendly start. You guys don't need me to tell you how much Gimli loves the Lady Galadriel by this point in the story, and so, in her defence, Gimli says to Eomer, "Let Gimli the dwarf, Glowin's son, warn you against foolish words. You speak evil of that which is fair beyond the reach of your thought, and only little wit can excuse you." And to this, Eomer gets understandably quite defensive. His men close in and advance their spears, and Eomer says the iconic line, "I would cut off your head, beard and all, Master Dwarf, if it stood but a little higher from the ground." Then Legolas escalates the situation. Eomer raises his sword, and Tolkien tells us that things might have gone ill if Aragorn hadn't sprung between them and talked everyone down to a much more reasonable level. And just before I move on to the friendship that grows from this animosity, I do want to give a little bit of a historical context for why the men of Rohan have this apparent disdain for dwarves. So, about 1,000 years before The Lord of the Rings, there was once a guy called Fram, and he was a lord of the Eotheod, the ancestors of the men of Rohan. And at this time, the Eotheod lived pretty close to the Grey Mountains, a place with a very large dwarvish community. Anyway, the thing that Fram is most famous for is the slaying of a dragon called Scatha, who was a significant enemy to all the peoples of that region. And after Scatha was slain, Fram took possession of the dead dragon's treasure hoard. The only catch, the dwarves of the Grey Mountains also claimed a stake in this treasure. Fram refused to share any of the jewels, and all he sent to the dwarves was a necklace made of Scatha's teeth. And according to the history of the Rohirrim, Fram was murdered by the dwarves for this rebuke. So, Eomer's initial disdain for Gimli does not come out of a vacuum. But this is why I think the ultimate friendship that does develop between Gimli and Eomer is so important. After Theoden is roused by Gandalf and Grima Wormtongue is banished, Gimli and Eomer begin to patch things up, and they ride out together on the same horse to do battle with Saruman. And at the Battle of the Hornburg, which in the books Eomer is present at from the beginning, Gimli ends up saving Eomer's life. So, if we skip forward now to the end of the story, we will find a lovely little conversation between these two characters that serves as a sort of sequel to their first conversation regarding Galadriel. At the coronation of Aragorn, Eomer finally lays eyes on Galadriel for the first time, and he talks to Gimli about her. Eomer begins by saying, "Gimli, Glowin's son, have you your axe ready?" To which Gimli says, "No, but I can speedily fetch it, if there be need." And then Eomer says, "You shall judge, for there are certain rash words concerning the lady in the golden wood that lie still between us, and now I have seen her with my eyes." Eomer goes on to say, "Alas, I will not say that she is the fairest lady that lives," to which Gimli replies, "Then I must go for my axe," but Eomer calms him down by saying that if he had seen Galadriel in any other company, I would have said all that you could wish. But now I will put Queen Arwen Evenstar first. Shall I call for my sword? But Gimli says no, and he bows low, and so at last Gimli and Eomer arrive at an understanding. And considering that Arwen is the granddaughter of Galadriel, this does seem like a fair compromise. Anyway, although this conversation marks the end of Eomer's appearance in the story, his friendship with Gimli continues long after the ending. In the appendices, we are told that after the destruction of the ring, Gimli eventually sets up a brand new dwarven colony in the glittering caves that lie behind the Hornburg at Helm's Deep. And so, as the Fourth Age begins, we see Gimli's dwarven colony existing independently within the kingdom of Eomer. And this means that not only is their friendship lovely in its own right, but it shows that just by being friends, Eomer and Gimli are able to repair the historical enmity that sundered the dwarves of the Grey Mountains from the Eotheod over 1,000 years ago.
Number 5.
Galadriel and Melan the Mire. So, back in the First Age, Galadriel is a very important part of the story before the exiled Noldor arrive in Middle-earth. She's a big player in her uncle Feanor's rebellion, and then she switches sides and fights against him during the kin-slaying at Alqualondë, and then she follows her other uncle, Finigolfin, across the treacherous Helcaraxë. However, unlike many other members of her extended family, once she arrives in Middle-earth, Galadriel sits out most of the rest of the First Age. She doesn't take part in any of the battles, and she spends almost all of her time in that age living peacefully in the guarded woodland realm of Doriath. Which brings us to Melyan, the Maiar Queen of Doriath. So, unlike most other great women of the First Age, Melyan is neither an elf nor a man. As her title suggests, she is a Maiar. She is of the same order as Olorine or even Sauron. And so she is an unbelievably powerful character. But what's so awesome about this is that when Galadriel came to dwell in Melyan's realm, these two characters developed an incredibly important friendship that goes on to define a huge amount of Galadriel's characterization in the Second Age and beyond. In fact, when we see Galadriel in the Third Age, ruling as the semi-divine magical lady of an elvish woodland realm, we see the full extent to which her friendship with Melyan affected her. Galadriel basically takes what Melyan teaches her in the First Age and uses it to become the Melyan of the Second and Third Ages. I think if we look at Galadriel's character and her personality, we will see that there is definitely a before Melyan period and an after Melyan period. Before Galadriel met Melyan, she was, among other things, quite brash and ambitious and hot-tempered. But after befriending Melyan, and after spending a few centuries as her sort of student, Galadriel flourishes into the super wise, super dignified, super powerful ruler that we all know she will later become. If Galadriel never had met Melyan, and had instead stayed with her uncle Feanor's people, I think she would be an entirely different character later in the story.
Number 4.
Legolas and Gimli. Surely all of you must have expected these guys to make the list. Legolas and Gimli have one of the most iconic friendships anywhere in all of Tolkien's writings, and the unlikely bond that develops between these two is one of the highlights of the whole Lord of the Rings. When they first meet, Legolas and Gimli aren't, well, they're not exactly enemies, but there is a great deal of animosity between the two, and there's a lot of learned cultural prejudices, which are only exacerbated by the fact that Legolas's father imprisoned Gimli's father only a few decades earlier during the events of The Hobbit. But over the course of the story, Legolas and Gimli bond to such an extent that their friendship becomes one of the most memorable parts of their characterization. And this friendship predominantly begins during their time in Lothlorien. I think that after witnessing evidence of the tragedy of Balin's colony in Moria, Legolas's attitude towards dwarfs softens a bit, but it is when Gimli meets the Lady Galadriel that things really begin to change. We are told that when Gimli heard Galadriel using his own ancient tongue, he looked up and met her eyes, and it seemed to him that he looked suddenly into the heart of an enemy and saw their love and understanding. After this, Legolas starts spending some quality time with Gimli. And Tolkien actually tells us that Legolas was away much among the Galadrim, and often he took Gimli with him, and the others wondered at this change. And after leaving Lothlorien, Legolas and Gimli pretty much stay together for the entire rest of the story. They share the same boat down the Anduin River, they hunt the Uruk-hai together, and they both follow Aragorn on his journey from Rohan to Gondor to the Black Gate. After briefly separating during the Battle of the Hornburg at Helm's Deep, Legolas and Gimli reunite when the fighting's over, and they have a wonderful little exchange about their future plans. Gimli recalls the wonder of the glittering caves that he beheld during the battle, and Legolas says to him, "You move me, Gimli. I have never heard you speak like this before. Almost you make me regret that I have not seen these caves. Come, let us make this bargain. If we both return safe out of the perils that await us, we shall journey for a while together. You shall visit Fangorn with me, and then I will come with you to see Helm's Deep." And this is a bargain that the two friends hold each other to. After the ring is destroyed, Legolas and Gimli do indeed venture off on a sort of Middle-earth road trip that takes them back to both Fangorn and the Glittering Caves. However, the final consummation of their friendship has to come in the form of their joint departure from Middle-earth. After Gandalf and Frodo and eventually Sam sail west and all the other members of the Fellowship die of old age, Legolas and Gimli are the last two left. And after Aragorn's funeral, Legolas knows that his time in Middle-earth is over, and he can no longer deny the sea longing that has awoken in his heart, and so he decides to sail west. But, unlike so many other elves, Legolas did not go to the Grey Havens to board a ship built by Círdan the Shipwright. Instead, he built his own boat, a grey ship, which he set upon the Anduin River and sailed downstream towards the sea. But as I'm sure all of you know, Legolas did not make this journey alone. When he departed Middle-earth forever, he took Gimli with him. And thus, due to their friendship, Gimli was afforded a fate that no dwarf had ever known before. He and Legolas passed over the Great Sea together, and in so doing, an end was come in Middle-earth of the Fellowship of the Ring.
Number 3.
Maedhros and Fingon. So this has got to be one of my all-time favourite First Age friendships, but I guess in many ways it kind of represents the opposite of Legolas and Gimli's friendship. Legolas and Gimli's story, as I've just said, is all about two very different groups of people coming together through one friendship. However, the relationship between Maedhros and Fingon is all about friendship enduring, even after one group of people, one family really, is split into two. You see, Maedhros and Fingon are not only very dear friends, they're also cousins. Maedhros is the eldest son of the super elf Feanor, and Fingon is the eldest son of Feanor's brother, Fingolfin. And despite the fact that Feanor and Fingolfin had a terrible relationship that effectively split the Noldorin elves into two conflicting factions, their sons did not follow this example. All the while that Feanor was being an absolute jerk to Fingolfin, Maedhros and Fingon were building a beautiful friendship. A friendship that would be greatly tested when Feanor turned the Noldor towards rebellion. So, long story short, Feanor rebelled against the Valar in the Undying Lands, and he led his sons and his people on a violent journey to Middle-earth. And among these sons, of course, was Maedhros. They sailed away from the uttermost west in stolen ships, but they left Fingolfin and his people behind. The understanding was that when Feanor's people arrived in Middle-earth, they would send the ships back for Fingolfin, but in a moment of, sociopathic spite, Feanor orders that the ships be burned instead, thus stranding Fingolfin and Fingon and all the others. And this is where we see the first key moment in the friendship between Maedhros and Fingon. Because at this point in the story, they are totally separated from each other, and their fathers are moving closer and closer to, all-out war. But Maedhros remains true to Fingon. He stands against his father when the ships are burned, and he mentions Fingon by name to try and dissuade Feanor from making such a horrendous, treacherous decision. Now, as it goes, Feanor is way beyond reason at this point, and the ships are burned anyway. But what I find so interesting here is that when Fingon learns that he and his father have been betrayed by Feanor, he has no way of knowing that Maedhros wasn't complicit. The only reason for believing that Maedhros didn't betray them too is faith in their friendship. And this faith comes back in a very big way, just a little later in the story. So, pretty much immediately after arriving in Middle-earth, Feanor and his sons win a great battle, but then Feanor gets himself killed by Gothmog, the Lord of the Balrogs, and not long after that, Maedhros is captured by Morgoth, and chained by the wrist to the sheer precipice of Thangorodrim, 3 volcanic mountains that were created by Morgoth. And here, Maedhros dangles helplessly for 24 years. But eventually, he is rescued, and his rescuer is, of course, none other than Fingon. So, while Maedhros is chained up, things only get worse among the two factions of the Noldor. Fingolfin's people do ultimately make it to Middle-earth, but the journey is harrowing and no small number are killed along the way. An elven civil war seems imminent, but it is averted by Fingon, because Fingon trusts so deeply in his friendship with Maedhros, who is by all accounts the enemy. Despite having no assurances that Maedhros would have done the same for him, Fingon sets out alone, and he journeys all the way to Thangorodrim, effectively to the doorstep of Morgoth's stronghold. And with a little help from the Lord of all Eagles, Fingon is flown up to Maedhros, where he tries to cut the chain that binds Maedhros to Morgoth's mountain. And this is an incredibly cool part of the Silmarillion that I go into a lot of detail on in this video, so check that out if you want to learn more. But when Fingon tries to cut the iron chain around Maedhros' wrist, he finds that it is utterly unbreakable. Maedhros begs Fingon to kill him, to put him out of his misery, but Fingon refuses. Instead, he cuts off Maedhros' hand, and together they fly away to safety. And this is a huge turning point in the history of the Noldor. After his rescue, Maedhros yields the kingship of the Noldor to Fingon's father Fingolfin, and in so doing, the feud that divided their people for so long is ultimately healed. The conflict that began with Feanor and Fingolfin is ultimately ended by their eldest sons, by the unconditional friendship of Maedhros and Fingon.
Number 2.
Beren and Finrod Felagund, Or actually, Finrod Felagund is, I think, how I should be saying that. I've been mispronouncing my favourite elf's name this whole time. It's quite embarrassing, really. Anyway, if Maedhros and Fingon are towards the top of my First Age friendships, then Beren and Finrod must be the absolute pinnacle of that list. Because the friendship of Beren and Finrod is not only a wonderful part of two wonderful characters' stories, it's also one of the most significant friendships in all of Middle-earth's history. It literally changes the fate of the First Age, and by extension, all future ages. So, as you all probably know, Beren is the mortal man who fell in love with the immortal Luthien Tinuviel, and he was tasked with reclaiming a Silmaril from Morgoth's crown in order for Luthien's father to allow them to be together. And Finrod Felagund is one of the most awesome and powerful elves of the First Age. He is another cousin of Fingon and Maedhros, and he's also the older brother of Galadriel. And something that I've been quite struck by as I'm making this list is just how many of these entries are about friendships between two very different characters from very different worlds. And I think Finrod and Beren are up there with like Legolas and Gimli for being one of the absolute most iconic interracial friendships in the entire Legendarium. But the reason that I've put these guys at number 2 is that the friendship between Beren and Finrod is not only wonderful, it's so cosmically important. Like, from the perspective of the creator himself, Eru Ilúvatar. Now, if you want to know the full and unabridged story of Beren and Finrod's friendship, I have just finished a whole 11 video playlist where I break down the epic tale of Beren and Luthien in all the wonderful detail it deserves, so check that out to learn more, and I talk about Finrod Felagund a lot in that playlist. But for now, what I will say is that the friendship of Finrod and Beren literally changes the world. You see, this Silmaril that Beren's been tasked with reclaiming is a hugely important part of the later Silmarillion. And without wanting to spoil too much, this reclaimed Silmaril will go on to be instrumental in bringing about the Dark Lord Morgoth's ultimate defeat at the end of the First Age. But none of that could happen without Beren's quest, and Beren's quest could not be successful without his friendship with Finrod Felagund. And this friendship doesn't just sort of appear out of nowhere, the foundations for it were laid hundreds of years before Beren was even born. The first named man ever to enter the story is a guy called Beor the Old. And he is the great-great-great-great-grandfather of Beren. And the first thing that Beor the Old does after arriving in Beleriand is develop a profound friendship with the first elf he ever meets. During the disastrous Battle of Sudden Flame, a few hundred years later, Finrod fights and almost dies, but his life is saved by a descendant of Beor's called Barahir, the father of Beren. As a token of gratitude and renewed friendship upon the battlefield, Finrod gives Barahir his ring, which becomes known as the Ring of Barahir and ultimately ends up on the finger of Aragorn over 6,000 years later. And Finrod also swears an oath of abiding friendship to Barahir and all of his kin. And this oath of Finrod's is absolutely essential in why he and Beren have such an amazingly important friendship. Because if we fast forward a few years to after Beren meets Luthien and after he's given his seemingly impossible quest to reclaim a Silmaril, it is Finrod Felagund whom Beren first seeks out. And when Finrod meets Beren for the first time, he needs no ring to remind him of his oath to Beren's father. Finrod basically gives up everything. He abdicates his throne and he sets out with only 10 other elven companions to accompany Beren off into danger due entirely to an oath of abiding friendship. And when I say danger, I really do mean it. Beren and Finrod and friends don't really make it very far at all before they're all captured by Sauron and imprisoned on his island of werewolves. All 10 of Beren and Finrod's elven companions are killed in Sauron's dungeons by his werewolf executioner, but when it comes time for Beren to be executed, Finrod Felagund put forth all his power and burst his bonds. He basically unleashes all of his high elven power, and with only his hands and his teeth, Finrod slays the werewolf and saves Beren's life. But he put forth all his power to do so, and in the end, he himself was wounded to the death.
Number 1.
Frodo Baggins and Samwise Gamgee. I can't imagine this number 1 pick is too much of a surprise for anyone, really. One simply cannot talk about love and friendship in Tolkien's works without ending on one of the greatest friendships in, I think, all of Western fiction, Frodo and Sam. And whether you're a Tolkien aficionado who's read every book he ever wrote, or whether you're a more casual fan who just really enjoyed the movies, either way, I'm sure you already know the story of Frodo and Sam's friendship, so I won't waste time going into the details right now. However, I would like to point out a big difference between the way that their friendship is portrayed by Peter Jackson and the way it was written by Tolkien. And what a massive part of this boils down to is Frodo's age. So obviously in the movies, Frodo was played by 18-year-old Elijah Wood, and he comes across as a very young character. But in the books, Frodo is 50 when he leaves Bag End, and I think this massively changes the dynamics of Frodo and Sam's friendship. Tolkien intended Sam to be younger than Frodo, 12 years younger in fact, 15 years younger in the Lord of the Rings 2nd edition, not the other way around. Frodo is the one with the life experience and the wisdom. He's very much the natural leader of the 4 hobbits, and Sam is the younger, less experienced and more parochial hobbit. And so, I feel like the movie version of Frodo and Sam's friendship is a lot more one-sided than it is in the books, and it's robbed of a great deal of its complexity. Because the other big thing that we need to be aware of in regards to Frodo and Sam is their difference in class, in social standing. And class is a really big deal to hobbits. Hobbits really do live by a pretty old school hierarchy of an elite aristocratic class, a wealthy middle class, and a salt-of-the-earth working class. And I don't want to belabor this point too much. Power in the Shire is far too decentralized for it to be too much of a moral problem, but truth be told, their society is pretty classist. And I think this is a really important part of Frodo and Sam's friendship. You know, the extent of their love is immense. The magnitude of their friendship puts them right at the top of this list, but despite that, Frodo and Sam are not social equals. I don't think it's fair to say that Bagginses are quite aristocrats, that's more like a Took or a Brandybuck thing, but the Bagginses are a family that sit pretty comfortably within the Hobbit upper middle class. And of course, when Bilbo returns with 1/14 of Smaug's treasure, they become known as an incredibly wealthy family. Also, Frodo's mother was actually a Brandybuck, so Frodo is anything but a working class Hobbit. Sam, on the other hand, is as working class as they come. It's reflected in his language, it's reflected in his ideas about the outside world, and it's reflected in his family, and what Tolkien calls his rustic love for Rosie. Not only is Sam Frodo's gardener, but his father worked as Bilbo's gardener. Sam was born in the same year that Frodo's parents drowned, and Bilbo adopted Frodo, and so, although we don't get many details about it, we can be fairly confident that Frodo and Sam would have been a part of each other's lives since childhood, but never as equals. Frodo was the heir to Bag End, and Sam was the son of the guy who kept its gardens. And this is why Sam refers to Frodo as Mr. Frodo, and it's a part of why he's so loyal and loving to Frodo. Frodo is a kind and affectionate master to Sam, and Sam is a loyal and devoted servant to Frodo. And although this may seem pretty unimportant by today's standards, this is how the societies of England and many other places worked for over 1,000 years. This lord and retainer dynamic was an integral part of the Anglo-Saxon cultures that Tolkien drew from, and it's even a dynamic that Tolkien would have been intimately familiar with in his own personal life. During World War I, British army officers were attended by orderlies, or personal servants, called batmen, and Tolkien was an officer in World War I. He would have had his own Batman who accompanied him into danger and undertook the roles like cooking and cleaning and carrying the luggage, just like Sam. In fact, in letter 131, Tolkien even explicitly stated as much. He wrote that my Sam Gamgee is indeed a reflection of the English soldier, of the privates and batmen I knew in the 1914 war and recognised as so far superior to myself. And I think this is huge, because during his own traumatic journey into peril, Tolkien would have represented much more of a Frodo than a Sam. He was, after all, a first-class honours student at Oxford University. He wasn't rich, but his family were middle class before he was orphaned, at the same age as Frodo, by the way, and when he did join the war, he did so with the rank of a second lieutenant, despite having never fought before. And yet it is Sam who Tolkien called the chief hero of the story. It was the working class Batmen that Tolkien described as so far superior to myself. According to John Garth's book, Tolkien and the Great War, Tolkien felt an affinity for these working class men. But due to military protocol, he was required to take charge of them, discipline them, train them, and probably censor their letters. If possible, he was supposed to inspire their love and loyalty. The British Army forbade friendships between officers and batmen, which I believe Tolkien found very difficult. He later wrote that the most improper job of any man is bossing other men. Not 1 in a million is fit for it, and least of all those who seek the opportunity. So, does this knowledge about Tolkien's experience in war alter our perceptions of Frodo and Sam? I certainly don't want to imply that Frodo is a stand-in for Tolkien. He's absolutely not. Frodo is his own character, but I certainly think that while Tolkien was writing Frodo and Sam's friendship, he was picturing, to an extent, himself and his Batmen in the trenches. Or at least picturing the friendship that he wished he could have formed with these men, if military protocol would have allowed it. And so, to end this video, I want to make it very clear that I'm not saying that the difference in social class in any way undermines Frodo and Sam's friendship. I'm saying quite the opposite. It enhances their friendship. Just like pretty much every other character on this list, Frodo and Sam are two characters who come from two different worlds, but they are bound together by one of Tolkien's most powerful themes, love and friendship. Anyway, happy Tolkien Reading Day, everybody. That's my list of top 10 favourite friendships in Tolkien's writings, so let me know if I missed any of your favourites, and feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. Also, look out for a pinned comment in which I'll talk about some of the honourable mentions that didn't quite make the list. And of course, to make sure you don't miss any future top 10 lists or any future First Age videos, hit subscribe if you haven't already, and don't forget to hit like and share this channel with your friends if you want to. But, as always, until next time, my dear friends, much love, stay groovy, and navaer melyn.